Hej och välkomna tillbaka. Mats Hård heter jag och är till vardags vd för en finansnyhetsbyrå som heter Finwire. Jag kommer vara moderator här under det närmsta passet. Vi ska gå vidare här i programmet och först upp på scen har vi Abliva och deras vd Ellen Donnelly. Welcome Ellen.
Thank you.
And please start your presentation.
Great. So as you said, I'm the CEO of Abliva. At Abliva, we're targeting the powerhouse of the cells to improve the lives of patients with primary mitochondrial diseases. So people often don't understand those first statements. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a background. So our human body contains over 38 trillion cells. They counted those. There's a great paper on it. I would never guess. 38 trillion cells and over 200 different cell types. Every single one of those cells has mitochondria in it. And the mitochondria are responsible for generating the energy that your cells need to do their job. Every cell in your body has those except your red blood cells. Does anybody remember hearing about mitochondria in biology? I frankly didn't. I probably didn't pay attention to that lecture, but this is the powerhouse of your cell. It is probably the most important organelle in your body because it gives your cells the energy that they need to do their daily job. So depending on how much energy your cell needs, it will either have a lot of mitochondria or it won't have very many. So the cells in our body that have a lot of mitochondria are your muscles, your liver, your brain. That's super important because if you have an issue with your mitochondria, you're going to see it there first. The other thing that's interesting about our mitochondria is that your DNA comes from your mom. It's not the same DNA you have in the rest of your body. And mitochondrial DNA is made differently, it's transcribed differently, and it's checked in a different fashion. And so you can often get mutations in that DNA. So as I mentioned, we are targeting the mitochondria to improve the lives of patients that have problems with their mitochondria. So it's that simple. We're looking for patients that have an issue with this mitochondrial DNA that's in every cell in your body. So what are these diseases? These are rare diseases. It's really interesting. So you probably haven't met somebody with primary mitochondrial disease because there aren't many there. They're devastating, debilitating disorders. These patients will have a life expectancy, depending on which mitochondria are impacted, of 10 to 35 years. If they get it as a baby, they'll probably die before the age of 10. There are no approved therapies. So once you're diagnosed with this illness, you're told, you have primary mitochondrial disease, and the good news is now we've told you what's wrong with you, and the bad news is that we don't know what we can do. Again, I mentioned that the organs with lots of mitochondria are going to be affected most. So we just had the Global Mitochondrial Disease Awareness Week, and in that we spent a lot of time talking to patients and learning more about this disease. So if you have any interest in learning about these patients, you can go to our website. There are a couple of videos that you can see there. And then Daniela, the patient down on the left, we just did an interview with. So go to our website and you can learn more about the patients because I think nobody can understand the importance of treating these patients until you hear from them directly. So now we're going to talk about the reasons I think Abliva has a really interesting case. So the first thing is that the colleagues here at Abliva have been working in mitochondrial dysfunction for over 20 years. So they've been working at it long before anyone even thought about targeting mitochondria. They've been working on dysfunction for over 20 years. Eskil Elmer is our founder. He's currently our CSO. And Magnus Hansen, who's here, I told him I was going to call on him, our chief medical officer, basically have been thinking about this longer than most people in the industry, maybe anybody in the industry. The nice thing about these guys is that they focus on two different things. So Eskil is our chief scientific officer, is involved in our research organization. Magnus leads our development organization. The reason that's important is that we can bring drugs from idea to compound to preclinical studies into human patients. And we're actually doing that in our study. So in many biotech companies of our size, you'll often hear that they have one drug in development. We actually have multiple shots on goal here with multiple drugs and a research portfolio. The second thing that makes us interesting is we're focused in rare diseases. And this is important because there are a lot of opportunities that come with drug development in rare diseases that allow a small company in Sweden to become the leader in drug development in this area. So we spent a lot of time talking to the regulators about our development plans, and they're on board with those development plans. They also let us do smaller studies. You'll often hear of oncology studies and cardiovascular studies that are enrolling 6,000 patients, and they're doing a couple of them. We have one study that needs to get us to market, and it's going to be 120 to 180 patients. That's it. So this drug could be on the market as early as 2026. We also have some pricing freedoms. And that's not something that we focus on, but it may be something that you're focused on. That means I can price the drug quite high. And so because there aren't many patients with this disorder, payers don't really care if it's priced at $300,000 a year. So that makes for a rather large commercial opportunity, which you can see here on the right. Peak sales in this diagram are shown at $1 billion. So this would classify as a blockbuster drug. You could see it could be making money in 2026, which is very different than many of the other companies you've heard from today. And these are pretty conservative estimates. I never like to show the highest case scenario because you wouldn't believe me. But the assessment here is done on the fact that we assume 50% will be diagnosed, 50% will be treated, will be the second to the market, and we'll price it at about $160,000 per year, with half of that in the UK. Those numbers could be low. They could be really low. So really, the nice thing about working in a rare disease is you have a de-risk program with streamlined development and blockbuster sales potential. So the third reason it's now is the time to be developing drugs in this area is that we now have these centers of excellence which are tracking the patients. So I'm sure when I said rare disease, you're like, oh, well, good luck with that. Where are you going to find these patients? We know where they are. There are about 2 to 3 centers in each country, and they're a similar number in each state. I'd say there are about 18 to 20 specialist centers in the US. So these centers are great because they track the patients, they make sure that the patients have a support network, but they also help us recruit these patients into clinical studies, which is the reason we really like these centers. And we've also seen the emergence of these patient advocacy groups, which you can see on the right. Again, they're there to help us develop our drugs, help us find the patients. They do a lot with the patients to tell them, this is a clinical study and this might be why you might want to participate in it. So that's also a good thing to have. The fourth thing is in this area, unlike some of the other spaces, it's not really being explored as much as it could. So you see that there's a rather low number of competitors here, and they're not names that you probably recognize. So I'm not competing with Sanofi, I'm not competing with Pfizer, I'm not competing with AstraZeneca, I'm competing with people you've never heard of before, which is actually a good thing. And the nice thing is, you can see here, we're all at the same stage of development. So the hope is that, any of these drugs make it out, fantastic. We can be used with any of them as well, so we're all complementary. These are all drugs that don't get into the brain. There's also another group of drugs that does. We, again, have another candidate in that area, which I'll talk to you about today. These guys are a little bit earlier than everyone else and looking at things that cause kind of seizures. This area is becoming more attractive to investors too, and so I wanted to show you some of the exits that have happened in this area because I think that's important. We're always thinking about, our next round of development, our next round of investment, our next opportunities. So you can see a number of the transactions in this space. Mitobridge was a company similar to Abliva. It was acquired by Astellas, a large Japanese pharmaceutical company, for $450 million. Not a bad acquisition. Reneo is one of the other ones you just saw. They did a Series B in 2020 of $95 million, and then they did an IPO later of $300 million. They're based in California. And the others are pretty well known as well. So you can see that there is, energy in the market for this type of company. So I would say the time right now is now to do what we're trying to do. We've got strong scientific understanding with a team that's been doing this for decades. We've got regulatory tools to help us. We've got patients that are tracked, monitored, and accessible. And we've got few competitors, and we're all at the same stage. So these things alone together kind of give you this nice profile with decreased risk, decreased time, and decreased cost to the market. So this is our portfolio. Our lead asset is KL1333. That really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? So KL1333 is about ready to start its study that we need to take it to market. So this is called a phase 2-3 study. You'll see we often call it a registrational study. It's important because it's the last one we need to do before we know if this drug can be sold to patients. That will start later this year. NV354 is actually a drug that came from our labs. So this is a great example of Swedish innovation moving to the next stage of development. It's getting ready to start that phase 1 study in healthy volunteers. And then we have other programs earlier in the portfolio that could be accelerated. So I'm going to talk today about KL1333 and NV354. So we'll talk first about KL1333. Again, as I mentioned, that's about ready to start clinical study. The biology here is pretty complex, but what it's trying to do is we're trying to increase the energy in the mitochondria. So your mitochondria in these diseases is broken, we're going to make it work again. We're targeting adult patients with multiple symptoms involved. So preclinically, we showed a number of things. There are just a few highlights here, and I'm happy to send anybody the data. But it improves mitochondrial function. We showed that the drug improves muscle function and impacts biomarkers that matter in this disease. We've also shown it has a really good safety profile, and that's another de-risking activity, is that this has been in over 110 healthy volunteers and patients, and has a very good safety profile. We've also done chronic toxicology on it, and we did a drug-drug interaction study. So when you're looking at drugs in this stage, one of the reasons they often fail is the safety profile, and so we're pretty confident that we have a good safety profile, or we wouldn't be moving into a registrational study. So we also went and did some did a patient study, because that's really important at this stage to have that patient data. And we looked at 3 clinical endpoints, and we looked at the endpoints that we thought mattered the most to patients and were a hit on the science. And so the 2 endpoints that we looked at in this study were fatigue and muscle myopathy. So here you can see the fatigue data that came out of our patient cohort. We had 2 patients that were given placebo. We had 6 that were given drug. You can see gray is the placebo, black is the drug. There's a nice separation between these bars. So that would suggest that the drug is doing something. The separation is actually pretty large as well. You know, it's a small sample set, so you can't talk about statistical significance, but that's a pretty nice difference in those 2 groups. And when you look at other indications, because we've never done this in PMD before, that actually seems to matter. So we call that a clinically meaningful difference. So instead of showing you statistical significance and variance, I'm showing you, a separation of groups and the fact that this could mean something to a patient. So if I went and asked a patient if they felt better, they would notice the difference. That's a big deal. So these were the 2 fatigue scales. And what we did at the same time we were running this study, we actually looked at the fatigue scales with the FDA and said, okay, is this the right scale to be offering these patients? And we thought that, there's some questions that are rather ambiguous that patients might interpret differently. And there's some questions that are really not relevant. And so we went and did another study where we actually validated this clinical endpoint for the PMD patient population. A big piece of work. And really what this does is it gives us confidence that that scale that we're about to use in this clinical study is actually relevant to these patients. So I'll give you an example. One of the questions that the team looked at was, in the past 7 days, how often have you had an issue doing strenuous exercise? So these patients can't get out of bed, so they're not going to do strenuous exercise. And you can imagine if I asked them that question in a clinical study, I'd probably get a negative result. So really important piece of work. This will be one of our primary endpoints in the study. The second thing we tested in that same group of patients was muscle weakness, because I told you that the muscles have a large number of mitochondria, so often this is something that the patients complain about. And proximal muscle weakness, your lower legs, is really where we're seeing it. And it could be maybe 70% of patients have an issue with their proximal muscle weakness. So this is a test that you can see on the left, 30 seconds sit to stand. You basically sit down and stand up as many times as you can within 30 seconds. We did that in a study, and you can see the data here. Again, we have good separation between the 2 groups. And if you look at the citations at the bottom, it was clinically meaningful in other indications in osteoarthritis and COPD. I might mention that these patients were only treated for 10 days with this drug, and they were treated with a very low dose. So this data was pretty phenomenal. We went one step further and analyzed the data, because many people always ask me, well, what's the variance in this response? And the interesting thing is you can see that here on the left. This is with the NeuroQual endpoint, but it looks the same in the others. And then you can see kind of how it translates. And if you've looked at this data before, what you'll see from that data is that the patients that had a lot of drug in their blood did much better. Patients that had less drug in their blood didn't do so well. So that tells us 2 things that are really important. It tells us, 1, that the amount of drug matters, and that means that the drug is driving the effect. So we always used to say, I came from Pfizer, I was at Pfizer for 10 years, and we were always talking about the 3 pillars and how you know a drug actually works. And this is a really key one, right? We want to know that the effect that we're having on the patients is not just by chance. So this is kind of some supporting evidence. So we're about ready to start this study. It's called the Falcon Study. I love that because I feel like these patients, they're stuck in their bed, they have no energy, and all of a sudden, hopefully our drug will allow them to take flight. It's a study that's going to run their dose for a year. So every patient is dosed for a year. Luckily, they're going to be at home most of the time. They come into the clinic very rarely. They'll take our medicine in the morning and at night. Again, adult patients, they need to have fatigue and they need to have myopathy in their legs to get into the study. And we'll run them to an interim analysis. So we're running the first 40 patients to the interim, which we've communicated as late 2023 or early 2024. And at that time, we'll have a really good feeling for the medicine because we don't want to waste our drug on patients if it's not working. It's another super important thing in the rare disease space. So that interim analysis will be very important to the company to get that first 40 patient data. And at that time, we'll decide if it's futile. We'll also decide how big the study needs to be. And so the study will either be expanded to 120 total patients or 180 patients, which you can imagine isn't many patients for a registrational study. So that's our first candidate, KO-1333. We have a second candidate, NV354, which is also very close to our heart because it came from our labs. So this one also will increase the energy in the mitochondria, but it does it in a completely different way. And the interesting thing about this one is it gets into your brain. So I just have a few slides on this, but the interesting thing is it was discovered because we were looking at Lee patient cells in our labs at Lund University and realized that there was an effect when you put succinate on them. The problem with that is succinate's naturally occurring in your body, but it's hard to get in there. So the group made a prodrug of succinate, and you can see some of the data here. We've got a green light now from the MHRA to start phase 1, and so we're just finishing the last stages of that. We've optimized the drug properties, we address common issues, and I think it's really going to be an interesting drug because of its ability to penetrate the brain. You can see just a bit of the new data from Barcelona here. We decrease inflammation in the brain, and we delay the presence of motor signs. And patients also had improved weight gain, which is pretty interesting because that's a problem in this patient population. So that's the two programs I'm going to talk about today. I think one of the things that we're proud of at Abliva is we managed to do a rather large financing back in June. When the markets looked so dire, we were out there raising money. And the exciting thing about that is we brought in a lot of new investors to the story, institutional and life science investors. And that was important because they're in it for the long term. And I think right now we all need investors that are in it for the long term. So really excited to have those guys on board. One of them came from the UK and we had a couple come in from Norway. So we did a directed share issue initially for 150 million, and then we opened it up to our current shareholders for another 50 million rights issue. And it was completed at a 7% discount. So we were super excited about that too. The best thing about that financing is it gives us a 2-year runway, which is nice in the current environment. It also actually gets our KO-1333 program through that interim analysis, and it allows us to progress NV354, so it's actually ready for the clinic. So super happy to have finished that financing in June, and thank you to anyone who contributed or participated, because it was not an easy time to be raising money, and we're really excited. It was actually recognized in BioWorld as one of the top 10 deals in Q2. We don't do this alone. We say we're small and nimble and flexible, but we have a great group of support around us. I'd like to highlight the Scientific Advisory Board on the right. These are scientific experts, clinical experts in the area. They're fantastic. We talk to them way more than we probably should, but they've helped us design the program and really make a program and a study that's patient-friendly and going to be of interest to the whole community. So they've been fantastic. And then the board of directors is on the left. You may recognize some of those names. Well-known names in Sweden and abroad. So great level of support from them. So I've told you all about Abliva now. Our focus is really to become a global leader in this area. We talked about why we can do that. You know, we have a team of experts that's been working in mitochondrial research or drug development for over 20 years. We just opened a subsidiary in the US. So trying with the American CEO to get some more attention from the US investors and the community there. It will also help us run our clinical study, as our clinical study that we're about to start is global and has US sites as well. So we're now trying to work from 2 countries. I think one of the other unique things is we do have research and we do have development. And we do have the ability to build a commercial group to sell this drug. And that's when you start to look out long term. If KO-1333 gets approved in 2026, we need to be out there selling it. And you saw that there are those centers of excellence. That makes it much easier because you know who you're selling to. The estimate in a rare disease, with a rare disease asset, that you have to have about 20 salespeople in the US. That's it. You know, you need a commercial team, but you don't need many people because the geography is so well mapped. So that gives us a real opportunity there to build a RD&C organization. We're one of the only companies in this space that has multiple assets, multiple chances here, and they're complementary. Not only are they complementary, they're first-in-class drugs, and they're complementary with everyone else that's developing drugs. So we're really excited about that. If someone else gets approved, that's not a bad thing. They'll just open up the market. More patients will get diagnosed, more patients will get treated, and that just gives us more opportunity as well. And as you know, we're publicly traded on NASDAQ, and we have 2 years of runway. So that's Abliva. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I take this in Swedish. Om ni har några frågor till Ellen så får ni gärna smsa in detta. Det står ett telefonnummer på presentationen som ni har fått. Om ni är osäkra på hur ni når oss. Interesting times for you guys. I think, I mean, you elaborate a little bit about the patient for the study. I guess you work with the Center of Excellences, and you also work with, I guess there are some organizations, or how do you de-risk?
Absolutely. The patient organizations are really important, and we've got great collaborations with all of them. An example is in the U.S., there's a patient organization called the UMDF, the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation, and they are a great source for these patients because when these patients get diagnosed, you can imagine they've never met anyone unless their mom has it, because they often have a mother that has it, but they don't know anybody else that has their disease, and so these patient advocacy groups really bring them in and help them. So we're in constant conversation with them. They often introduce us to patients, and they helped us actually recruit for our PMD specific fatigue endpoint. So super important. You can hear from Daniela. We did an interview with Daniela this week, and so you can hear about her story. She's impacted by both muscle fatigue or muscle weakness and fatigue, so it's nice. But we spend a lot of time talking to the patients. I think part of the problem with drug development is you say, okay, I want to develop a drug that's important, and then you miss the patient experience. And so we've really tried to focus our endpoints on the patients and what matters the most to them.
Yeah, I understand. I think when it comes to drug development, sometimes you do, like you, phase 2, 3 at the same time. Does that affect the result when you're finished? How does that differ to a traditional phase 3?
Yeah, that's a great. So usually you do phase 1, and that's your healthy volunteers, and then you do phase 2, and that's your proof of concept, and then you do phase 3, and that's your big study. Usually you have 2 of them. So in rare diseases, that whole process has been shrunken down, and it is a benefit because you can get your drug to the market more quickly, but it means you have to do a lot of things all at the same time. And so as a company, it's rather, if I could say, stressful because you're doing, chronic toxicology much earlier than you would normally do. But the nice thing is that you have that one study. So it makes it a little bit difficult because you still have to have that same package of supporting data for that one study, but you just have a shortened time to do it. So at this point, we announced last year that our IND had been approved in the US. It had been accepted by the FDA. And that means that we're green-lighted to start that study. And so, again, we did the UK. We announced that earlier this year as well. So as the countries start to approve the drug, that risk dramatically decreases. The risk is usually on safety or efficacy. And so luckily we have a great safety package, and then the efficacy comes from that phase 1B study and the preclinical experiments that we've done.
Yeah, so this is the study.
This is absolutely it. This is the study. The nice thing about when you ask about risk profile is in the rare disease space, these patients have nothing, and they're often dying early. So the regulators are often very, we're in constant discussions with them. They're very accommodating to data that may not be statistically significant across every single endpoint. So what you see, and you all know this because you watch companies coming for approval, there's often a discussion that takes place. And so the nice thing about our study is we've de-risked it by having 2 primary endpoints. And that's important because usually you have to hit on your primary endpoint before you can go analyze anything else. We have 2 primary endpoints that we can hit on. So we'll either hit on fatigue, hit on muscle weakness, or hit on both of them. Okay. And that's a unique place to be. So that's called an alternate endpoint approach, and we call it 2 shots on goal. So that, again, will de-risk it. And the constant conversation with the regulators helps because we know what they need to see to be successful.
Yeah, a follow-up on the end game. I mean, hopefully for the patients and for the shareholders, you will have a positive development, I guess. What's the next step for your company? I mean, you are a niche product, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to go to market by yourselves, or do you think you will need to work with partners? Or
Great question. Being a small company, we always look at all possible opportunities in that space. I think we do, we could take it out alone and commercialize it ourselves. We would probably look for a commercial partner in Europe. Yeah. Because the European market is much more difficult, but we could do it ourselves in the U.S. We could also look for opportunities to collaborate on that. Big pharma isn't in this yet, but they always could be. So there are a lot of different opportunities. The nice thing is we are preparing ourselves for all options. And so we have the appropriate conversations to support those.
Yes, of course. The patients you're recruiting, are they all based in U.S.? You talk a lot about the U.S. Or do you also have patients here in Sweden and in Europe? Or,
yep, good question. U.S. and it's U.S. and Europe. Yeah. So we're recruiting a global study, and we'll get some of the patients from the U.S. and then some of them from here in Europe. So that's important to us.
Yeah, the COVID crisis, is that over the hill now? Because I guess these people are I guess. I mean,
they're very prone to getting it. Yeah. So you can, exactly that. They're, they don't want to get. None of us want to get COVID, but it was it's extremely difficult if they get it. So the interesting thing is, we were running that phase. You saw the data from our phase B1 study. It was running in the UK in the midst of COVID. And so you can imagine that UK hospitals were overrun with COVID cases. There are patients in the hall dying of COVID, and then we're trying to recruit a clinical study. So big thank you to the 8 patients who contributed in that. So I think we actually recruited a phase 1B study in the height of COVID in the UK, which was probably the worst place to get it, and did okay. I think we're not there yet. We were laughing that, can we start calling it an endemic? Well, I don't know, probably not quite yet. But that's kind of, we need to think about it. Our risk profile is always based on the fact that COVID could hit again and could hit more strongly. We're still seeing a lot of, the hospitals, I think people are still coming back to work. And so I think things might slow down a bit, but we're hoping it doesn't hit like it did before.
No, not like a big postponement of the entire study. You don't think that will happen? No.
No, but I have to tell you, I'm still in the U.S. We're much more still impacted by COVID than I think you are here. And so we recognize that each country is kind of in a different place on that trajectory.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience regarding your finances. You made a share issue now.
Yep.
This summer, right?
Yep.
And how long is that money lasting? I mean, the studies, it's the study, so I mean, it costs, I think everyone knows that. For how long are you financed?
So we raised financing for 24 months for the first part of that study. So that's to the interim analysis to the first 40 patients. Yeah. And then we'll likely do another raise there at the end of that once we know how big this study will be.
Yeah, okay, so we will have some data before you will raise more money.
Yeah, right? It'll be blinded data. So I'm not going to promise you data because you need to keep it blinded at that point to continue the study, as everyone I think knows. But yeah, there will be an indication. We'll do a futility and a sample size adjustment at the interim.
Yeah, I understand. One more question. The other project you have, what can we expect the next 18 months.
So that project, actually, what we've raised for in this round is a bit softer. So the plan is to just get everything done, all the boxes checked, in order to be able to take that to the clinical phase 1 study. So that's still a story to be read out, but that has very little risk associated with it right now. It's more about doing a lot of work. And we have a limited team that's trying to get a global study started. So that's the reason that one's progressing a bit slower.
Yeah, sure. You were talking a little bit about the US. You're building a US presence as well. You're not planning to make a dual list of your company?
I think that's everyone's goal at some point, that there's a great access to capital in the US. There's, as we all know, I think the valuations there are rather significantly overvalued, the companies. So that's always an opportunity. I think right now we focus on the patients, we focus on our company here in Sweden. We have a subsidiary, we opened a subsidiary in Boston. I'm based out of Boston. I spend time here every month and then time in Boston. So we're trying to kind of build both. But I think, a US IPO would be a faraway goal, but always a goal, I think, in everybody's company.
Yeah. Okay. I had one question from the audience as well, and they were asking if you have invested by yourself in the company.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a share program with the board as well. But yes, we all invested. I think everybody in the company is invested. We're proud of what we're doing.
Yeah. Sounds good. Thank you very much, Ellen. We need to move on in our program today.
Great.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Och ni andra, häng